I never expected to be writing any of this down. I never wanted to, but it has gotten to the point where I feel like if I don't put it somewhere outside of myself, it will eat me alive. I used to laugh at those creepypasta stories and supposedly true horror accounts posted online, people swearing their haunting or encounter was real. I thought it was all exaggerated for entertainment value, and clicks I never imagined I would one day write my own, except nothing about this feels like entertainment. Nothing about it feels like a story. This is my life now. It started with the sound of phone ringing from my bedroom drawer, not a normal ringtone, not my phone, not any phone I have ever owned. The sound was old like the shrill chime of landline phones from decades ago, but distorted like it was being played underwater or fed through broken speakers the first time it happened. I had just come home from work late. It was after midnight. I was tired and half undressed, ready to collapse into bed when it started. The drawer of my bedside table rattled slightly, as if something inside was vibrating. Then the ringing filled the room. My first thought was simple, stupid. Even I assumed maybe my own phone had somehow fallen inside the drawer. Though I knew I had left it charging on the desk across the room, I froze staring at the drawer, my pulse thudding in my ears. There was no reason for that sound to be coming from there. I live alone. No one else has a key to my apartment, and no one had been inside. The ringing continued steady, unrelenting, mechanical. The sound seemed wrong, though. It was clear it was a phone ringing. There was something off about the rhythm, like it rang too long between pauses, as if the system behind it didn't quite understand how a phone should work. I reached forward, hesitant, hand trembling, and pulled the drawer open. Inside was nothing, only the usual contents: pens, an old notebook, receipts, scraps of junk mail, a broken wristwatch. But no phone. The sound cut off instantly the moment the drawer opened. Not faded, not lowered, just stopped like a switch had been flipped. I sat there staring into the drawer for a long time, heart hammering every rational explanation. Churned through my mind stress, exhaustion. Maybe I had dreamed the sound. Maybe it had come from outside the apartment, thin walls, carrying noises in strange ways. But no, I had heard it from inside the drawer. I had felt the vibration against the wood of the nightstand. I slammed it shut. Again, locked my bedroom door, and eventually, after a long sleepless stretch, I convinced myself it had been nothing. The second time it happened 2 nights later, I was less able to rationalize. It was the same sound, the same shrill, distorted, ringing, rattling against the inside of the drawer, only this time it started at 3 a.m. Exactly the time glowed on my digital clock, red numbers sharp in the dark, when the ringing began again, and this time it didn't stop when I opened the drawer. It kept ringing loud, piercing, and yet no phone was there. The junk inside my drawer sat completely still. The papers didn't even shift. The broken watch lay unmoving. I pulled everything out, threw it onto the floor, desperate to prove there had to be something hidden underneath, but nothing. The drawer was bare, and the sound still came from it. The ringing reverberated from the wood itself, as if the drawer was the phone. I didn't know what else to do. I slammed it closed. The sound stopped instantly again. That night I didn't sleep. I sat awake staring at the nightstand, waiting for it to start again, but it didn't. Over the next week it kept happening, always at night, never during the day. Sometimes at midnight, sometimes at 3, sometimes just as I was about to fall asleep, sometimes waking me from a dead rest. It always came from the drawer, always the same unnatural ring, always stopping the instant the drawer was shut or opened. I started leaving it open at night, hoping that would prevent it. But then one night the ringing started anyway from the empty air above the open drawer, the sound filling the room with nowhere to hide. I panicked, shoved the drawer closed again, and it went silent. It became clear this wasn't just some mechanical glitch or auditory hallucination. Something was trying to reach me through that drawer. I don't know how else to describe it. Something that knew how to use the sound of a ringing phone like bait. Then came the night I made the mistake of answering it. It sounds absurd, or right, because there was no phone, there was nothing to pick up, nothing to answer. But when the ringing started again, my exhaustion and dread had reached a breaking point. I snapped, I leaned over the drawer and set out. Loud hello, and the ringing stopped. What followed was not a dial tone, not silence, but a voice, faint crackling, as if carried over an ancient line, the words broken by static, but undeniably human. I have been trying to reach you. The voice was male deep, flat and motionless, like someone speaking through layers of distortion. I recoiled from the drawer, slammed it shut hard, racing the words repeated, muffled through the wood. I have been trying to reach you. That was the first night I started sleeping on the couch. But even there, the ringing followed, not from a nightstand this time, but from the kitchen drawers, the same distorted chime, echoing through the apartment at impossible hours, and always, if I dared to acknowledge it, always the same line, whispered through the static. I have been trying to reach you. I don't know who, I don't know what, but the more I ignore it, the louder it gets. I keep telling myself I'll move out, but something about this feels attached, not to the apartment, not even to the drawer itself, but to me, because last night it happened at work. I stayed late alone in the office, everyone else gone, and for the filing cabinet across the room, I heard it, the shrill, distorted ring faint at. First, then louder, until the metal shook. With a vibration, I opened it. Of course, there was nothing but folders and papers, but the ringing persisted until I whispered hello, and the voice came through again. I've been trying to reach you, and then for the first time it added more now. I have found you. After that night at the office, when the voice said now, I have found you, something in me broke. I went home shaking. I told myself I would never open another drawer, never answer the ringing again. But fear and compulsion are not separate things. They are two sides of the same blade. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more it cut in my mind. The ringing followed me everywhere now. It was no longer bound to the bedroom nightstand. It came from the bathroom cabinet when I brushed my teeth. It came from a dresser when I dressed for work. It came from the glove compartment of my car on the commute. It came from the desk drawer at work. Every closed space became a potential mouth through which that voice could try to reach me. And I always swore I would not answer again. But the human mind cannot endure that kind of relentless repetition. The sound wore me down, stripping away sleep, stripping away rationality, until one morning, as the drawer in my kitchen rattled with the piercing shrill, I slammed it open and whispered, "Fine. What do you want?" The voice was immediate, clearer than before, still distorted, but more forceful. "You kept me waiting." I dropped to the floor, my hands clutching my head, shaking. No, I did not want to be speaking with it, but the voice continued as if I had invited it in by acknowledging it. "You left me here for so long, alone in the dark. I tried so many times to reach you, you never picked up until now." I shouted, "Shut up, stop." But my voice sounded pathetic against the hiss of static that filled the drawer, the voice deepening into something almost satisfied. "Now we can begin to call," ended abruptly, the drawer falling silent. And for the rest of that day, I waited, sick with dread for what would begin. It did not take long that night. I dreamed of phones, thousands of them stacked in endless rows, the old rotary kind with their circular dials, their cords twisted into tangles. I walked between them in an infinite warehouse, and every single phone began ringing at once, their shrill, distorted tones rising until they became a single deafening scream. I woke on the couch, covered in sweat, ears still ringing, the dream bleeding into waking reality, because from a nightstand drawer the sound was still there when I opened it this time. There was something new. A phone, an old black rotary phone, sat inside my drawer, impossible, far too large to fit, but crammed into the space as if the wood had stretched to contain. The receiver lay crooked against the dial, and it was ringing, the drawer vibrating with its fury. I slammed it shut and screamed until my throat tore, but the ringing still seeped through the walls of the drawer, bleeding into the apartment, filling every corner. I stuffed towels around the nightstand, tried to bury it under clothes, but the sound only grew louder until, in a moment of broken resignation, I pulled the drawer open again and grabbed the receiver. The static hissed in my ear and beneath it, the voice deep and "Please, now you are listening." I dropped the receiver back into the drawer and ran from the room, but the ringing followed, the distorted chime echoing from every surface around me. I shoved my hand against my ears, but it vibrated inside my skull. That was the first night I realized I could not escape it, not by leaving the room, not by shutting the drawer. The phone had taken root inside my life like a parasite. The days after blurred together in a haze of dread. I avoided my bedroom, I avoided drawers, but they sought me out anyway. The glove compartment rang every time I drove the locker at the gym, the file cabinets at work, one by one. They became carriers of that same voice, always waiting, always repeating. I've been trying to reach you. People started to notice I was slipping. My coworkers asked if I was sick. My boss told me to take time off. My eyes were sunken. My hands trembled constantly. I had not slept more than an hour or two in days. But how could I explain it to them? How could I tell anyone my drawer was calling me? I thought of moving, changing apartments, burning the nightstand, but deep down I knew none of it would matter. The phone was not an object, it was a presence, and it had latched onto me. The final straw of that week came when I visited my parents for dinner, hoping to escape the suffocating noise, to remind myself I still had a normal life left. And halfway through the meal, I heard it from the silverware drawer in their kitchen. My mother noticed me flinch, asked if I was all right, but I could only stare at the drawer as it rattled softly, unheard by them, the ringing rising in my skull, until I excused myself and ran outside. The calls had followed me home, and the voice would not stop until I answered again. By the time the third week began, I was unraveling. I had started keeping my phone switched off, not my real phone, but the one I carried in my pocket, the modern smartphone. I could no longer stand the idea of answering calls of any kind. Even the normal ringtone triggered panic in me, because I could not tell anymore if it would be a coworker or that other voice waiting on the other. And the strange thing was, it never came through my real phone. Never. It only used the impossible ones, the drawers, the hidden spaces, the phantom rotary set on my nightstand. And I began to think maybe it wanted me to disconnect from everything else, to isolate me, so that only it could reach me. The dreams grew worse every night, more vivid, more impossible. I dreamed of operators in an endless switchboard, plugging and unplugging wires, their faces blank, their mouths sewn shut, and still the phones around them rang without pause. I dreamed of my childhood bedroom, the drawers all yanked open at once, and from each one hands reached out, holding black receivers pressed to ears, whispering static. When I woke, I often found my drawers already open, as if someone had been searching through them while I slept. And then the voices changed. One night, the ringing began from the dresser again, and when I opened it, instead of the single deep voice, I heard two whispering, overlapping phrases in unison. "You left us, you left us, you left us," over and over until I slammed it shut. But then the bathroom cabinet started the same two voices continuing, and when I opened it, the sound had multiplied. 4 voices now, each broken by static, but repeating the same phrase, "You left us," until the walls seemed to vibrate. It grew each night, 2 voices, then 4, then 8, until the ringing carried dozens of overlapping whispers, not one presence reaching out to me, but a chorus all crowding at once. And the words shifted no longer only. "You left us," Now they began to murmur details from my own life, things they could not know. We saw you at the office last night. We watched you in your car. We heard what you said to your mother. It felt like surveillance, like I was being recorded, not only when I answered, but constantly. One night, I made the mistake of demanding, "Who are you? What do you want?" And the voice closest to the receiver shifted into a tone so cold it froze my stomach. "We are the ones who wait." I tried to throw the drawer out. I carried the whole nightstand into the alley, smashed it apart with a hammer, but the sound still came from the broken shards of what still rang, as though the splinters themselves were wired into the line. At work the cabinets rang, until coworkers looked at me strangely because they heard nothing, only me pressing my hands to my ears, trembling. I stopped going to work. I stopped leaving my apartment. The only thing I heard day and night was the chorus of static voices calling from every drawer, every closet, every cupboard. And then came the night. I found the note. It was slipped inside my notebook, the one I kept in the drawer. Before all this began, paper, yellowed, handwriting jagged. It said, "Simply stop ignoring us, answer, and we will show you." I burned the note immediately, but the voices hissed and laughter through the wood the next night. When I answered in broken exhaustion, the deep voice returned louder than ever, overpowering the chorus. "Now we begin." That was the night. I saw the hands from the gap of the drawer, thin, pale fingers push through, curling around the wood, groping outward as the phone rang harder than ever. And in the static, I heard them say, "Soon we will not need the drawer." And all the hands became the proof and the threat all at once. And once I knew they were real, nothing else in my life made sense. The drawers stopped being mere furniture and became living thresholds. The wood itself animate with a will that was not mine. I learned to recognize the early rattle the way a predator pads before it strikes, a soft percussion that rose through the grain and into my bones. It was not always at night. Sometimes it began at dawn, when the light was wrong and thin and my mind was still brittle with sleep deprivation. When the fingers first appeared, they were small like a child's, but with an odd dryness to them, as if they had been submerged in dust for years. The first time I saw them, they were pressed against the inside face of the drawer, like someone cupping the wood. From within, I remember the precise way the grain aligned with the knuckles, and how my chest lodged with a noise like a fist. I could not move for a long time until the ringing began, and then the drawer trembled as if coughing, and the fingers withdrew all at once, as if embarrassed to be found. After that, the appearances grew bolder. The fingers slid between the slats of the old dresser, as if the wood had been carved to allow them passage. They curled around the lip of the drawer, and when the phone rang, the nails drilled panoramic circles into the finish, leaving faint crescents of pale wood. When they first hooked my thumb, it was curious, not violent, a slow, gentle tug at first, then firm enough to stop my breath. I remember clamping my free hand over the area where they had emerged and feeling the coolness of skin through the fabric of my pajama sleeve, as if the barrier between us had thinned to cloth. I tried every rational response I could think of. I replaced a nightstand with a modern metal chest. I removed every old piece of furniture from my apartment. I wrapped drawers in duct tape and sealed them with locks. I filled closets with cement bags, and still the sound found me. It changed its voice in response to my barricades, becoming lower in tone, more patient. It learned my measures and preferred to test me rather than assault me. It seemed to enjoy the theater of my fear. The keepers, who had once been only a rumor in my mind, reached out. Then, as if the train had expanded beyond tracks and transferred some of its methods to other phenomena, people with the same hollowed eyes, they had warned me of ritual and precedent. They told me about thresholds that should never be breached, and the price for fiddling with a tongue you cannot hear one of them wrapped iron nails across my window frame. Another left salt around the base of my bedroom door. A third scrawled an invocation that he refused to speak aloud because he said some words bind more than they protect their assistance, bought hours more than safety. I found that rituals only delayed the hands. They did not stop them. The hands adapted. They learned new ways to press through the grain, and seems my apartment felt like a sieve, and I was made of the water that could not be held. Back doors became front doors, and the hours of day and night blurred. The calls came from drawers in other apartments that I could see through the hallway window, and even from drawers I could not see at all. It was as if a network of closed places had become a map of where the entity could reach, and I was the center of its compass. The multiplicity of voices had become organized. They no longer spoke only of abandonment. They began to instruct. They wanted me to do things, small, trivial things at first. Retrieve a particular photograph from the bottom of a box, write a name on a piece of paper, fold it 3 times, then place it under the mattress. The things felt like rites, and I complied in confused obedience because the voice promised cessation, promised silence, then uttered commands that had to do with memory. They made me go through shoeboxes filled with postcards and pull out ones. I had never sent letters. I had never mailed receipts from restaurants with names I did not recognize, yet the handwriting matched nothing. I owned when I resisted openly. The consequences escalated. The hands would press more insistently through the wood, sometimes across my skin. If my arm lay across a drawer, the pressure would be deliberate and fast, like a warning or a bruise forming from the other side of the world. I began to wake with the same pattern of bruises spaced along my forearms, as if someone had used my body to practice a map. The voice began to hum in a lower register like an engine idling, and it started to add times to its messages. It demanded that I be ready at certain hours. Stood the front porch for 3 nights at 2 in the morning, watched the street, and nothing visible ever happened. But then when I returned inside, the drawer that held the old photograph of my grandmother was open, and a new image lay on top. A picture of the street where I had stood only hours before, but the lamplight in the photograph shone in an angle that had not been possible. I tried to document everything, and it felt almost useful until I could not tell anymore whether my notes were my memory or the entity's rewriting of events. I would write down the sequence of the calls, the wording of the voice, then find later the handwriting on the paper altered with an ink that shimmered faintly in the dark. In one note, the phrase "answer now" had been neatly printed beneath my own scrawl in a hand that matched none of mine. I started photographing the drawers and the places where the hands emerged, and the photos came back with smudges or with faint imprints of silhouettes that did not belong to any person I could name. A neighbor confronted me once, asking if I could keep the noise down, and I nearly laughed until I realized she had said the word we had been taught never to speak aloud. The hands had convinced me with whispers and images that the house was not my house, and perhaps it had been correct. I had been given false solidity by years of assuming that walls mended the world. The hands taught me that inside small confines other logics govern things like silence and reach, and that the human instinct to close a space had attracted something that lived precisely by those closures. The voice altered its promises to threats and bargains. It offered me visions in exchange for tasks, like a merchant offering wares. It showed me, through the static small cinemas of my childhood, the eyes of my father at the kitchen table, the face of a woman I had loved and lost. It offered me the secret of what had happened the night my brother disappeared when we were teenagers, a memory that had walked sideways in my head for years. I had always suspected he ran away, that he had made the choice to vanish and left me with blame and guilt, but the voice promised clarity. And when my hand trembled to accept the bargain, it released a warmth like a hand placed over mine, and the drawer vibrated. I could see an image pressed into what a map of a road, and a name, and for the first time a date appeared in my head with crystal clarity, and I knew I would go, because obsession makes lies irresistible. When they promised closure, the journey to the place the voice named turned out to be a hollow triumph. It was a derelict motel on the outskirts of town with peeling paint and rooms that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and bleach. We walked the hallways with a friend from the keepers who had insisted on coming, and in room 7 we found a small trunk with photographs of my brother as a child tucked inside, with a note written in a hand I had never seen, and yet the ink matched the alterings in my notebook. It was proof, and also not proof, because any evidence the hands wished to produce could be produced. They manufacture coherence with an artful cruelty. They give you breadcrumbs that look like paths, and then the paths fold under your feet. After that trip, everything accelerated. The voice grew louder and more impatient, the hands more frequent, and their invasions no longer limited to when my phone vibrated, with incoming calls that had no numbers, the screen filled with unknown symbols, and when I answered the call, my voice would be recorded, then played back a moment later with a delay, and the drawer would ring in counterpoint. It felt like the world was being mirrored through a faulty echo chamber, and I was the instrument used to tune it. The entity wanted me to be both listener and performer simultaneously. On a rain-slicked evening, I came home to find my apartment rearranged as if someone had been studying my life and rearranging it like a stage set. I found stacks of photographs on the dining table, each photo depicting a different room from a childhood home I had never visited, yet I recognized in them the light angles of my own memory. The voice instructed me to count the pictures and then to burn one for each year I had been alive, and when I hesitated, the hands burst from the freezer drawer like skeletal crabs and dragged a pan to the floor, clattering with the sound of metal being. Claimed it never used blunt force, it used implication. It caught me in a shape that left me unsteady and eager to do its dark work. Sleep became impossible, and yet during the small hours I would dream again and again of telephone operators in a room that was an impossible geometry, where drawers were wide enough to hold entire streets, and the operators stored entire people in wooden cells. I woke with my mouth full of dust at times, and once with a fragment of old phone cord wrapped around my wrist like a vow. The keepers began to thin. They disappeared to their own obsessions, or went away, quietly shaken. Some left town, and others were found days later in their apartments, with their drawers open and empty, their faces carved into expressions that made me sick to look at. I felt the perimeter shrink with each loss. I felt the hands close like a fist around a life I had not known had been borrowed. Then the final test happened. The voice called for me at dawn, precise and clear. It told me to go downstairs to the lobby, to the old elevator, and to stand there at 9. It promised that at 9 the answer would be given. The voice spoke with a tenderness that made my stomach turn. It sounded like my mother calling me home. I knew if I did not go, something worse would happen, because worse had already been happening in quiet increments. And if it could promise me relief, I was ready to walk into any trap. I stood in the gray morning under the hum of fluorescent lights. The elevator doors were scuffed with fingerprints from 1,000 hands. I felt the watchful static on my skin, as if a sun bloomed beneath the surface. The voice said, "You were chosen, not picked," and the words tasted like copper. I did what it told, and the doors opened to a corridor that should not have been the building had no such corridor. Older apartments folded into secret spaces, sometimes to hold trash or pipes, but this corridor was different. It smelled of varnish and telephone wire, and wood was polished like a dollhouse at the far, and a drawer sat on a pedestal, a reclaimed antique, small and heart-shaped. Its brass handle gleamed even under the pallid light. It was open, and inside lay a tiny phone the size of a locket, black and ancient, with a dial that would not move. I felt my feet draw me forward like a marionette and reached my hand to take it. The moment my fingers brushed the receiver, the world shifted like a shutter closing. I felt pain like static across my skull, and a chorus of voices flooded my mind. Not the voices outside, but the voices of those kept inside the drawers. Hundreds, maybe thousands of voices layered like pages in a book. They spoke together, and they named me, and when they named me, I realized the bargain I had been lured into. They had been waiting for someone who would listen and keep a ledger, someone to be the mouthpiece who would answer when they called. They needed a person who could translate their silence and a presence. They needed a steward. I had been careful and curious and broken enough to take the role, and the hands had been patient and clever in training me to accept it. I felt the phone press against my ear, and I heard my own voice speaking through it, but not from my throat. A voice that was mine and not mine, reciting names and addresses and the small betrayals I had thought were secrets. The hands had opened me like a drawer and were reading from the things they found inside me. And in doing so, they had inside them a mechanism to keep going. I do not remember leaving the building that day, only that my jeans were torn and my palms smelled like varnish. The keepers found me under the bridge on the riverbank later that evening, hugging my satchel of papers to my chest and muttering numbers I did not understand. They told me I had been gone for 12 hours, though my phone recorded only 35 minutes. I had the little drawer phone in my pocket, and when I looked at it, the dial was a blur. I wiped it with my sleeve and found small crescents of pale wood where the hands had once hooked. By the end of part 4, I understood the terms of my captivity. I was not simply observed anymore. I had become a node, a hub for their reach. The drawers in my apartment were a network of mouths, and I had become the tongue. The entity no longer had to push its hands through wood to be heard. It had taught me to answer, so that my answers could carry its will further into the world. I slept in short bursts, and always with one hand on the small black phone, as if to restrain some impulse. I knew I did not own the world outside. Continued in its oblivious ways. People talked about brunch and bills and weather while my life became a ledger, and the hands practiced new ornaments of cruelty to ensure I remained their reader. The final month collapsed time into a single shape and filled it with voices. In the beginning, I had framed the phenomenon as an error, a haunting, or a delusion, but by then there was no longer any comfortable frame, only the record. The calls multiplied, and their demands became dossiers. I was instructed to file names into envelopes, to mark dates on calendars, to speak phrases into taped microphones that I later found buried beneath my mattress. Each action felt like accession, my life being cataloged and redistributed by a force whose grammar was ritual and whose motive was to proliferate itself through attention. When they first used my voice, it was subtle, a slippage in conversation that friends did not notice, but close reading of recordings revealed anomalies. My recorded messages contained layered speech, a murmured appendage of tones layered under my own voice that, when isolated, sounded like old ringtones, and names whistled. Backward, I would play the tapes until my eyes bled with sleep, and then record myself again and again to prove to myself I was not making it up, but the evidence always moved a step ahead of me, the tape altering overnight to say things I did not remember, recording the hands found new, seams to press through not just drawers, but the seams between people. I began receiving packages with no return address, packages containing objects I had once owned and forgotten, a sweater my friend had given me years ago, a postcard from a town I had never visited, but had once dreamed of. The objects were arranged the way one arranges proof, and I felt humiliation like a physical weight for the way the entity knew the small ciphers of my life better than I did. More keepers lost themselves. They were found with their drawers open and their thoughts cataloged on scrap paper, with phrases like "answer now" repeated until their handwriting shredded. It was as if the entity wanted witnesses to proliferate, so that each witness might in turn become a conduit for others. They wrote their records like prayer and left them where the hands could pluck them like fruit. I read the ledgers later and felt sickness at the way they cataloged human lives, as if listing things in boxes made them less real. Then one night the phone stopped ringing and everything changed. The silence came like a release at first, and I felt hope like a tide coming in, but the hope was a trap, because the silence was not absence, but fullness. They had accumulated enough attention, enough voices, and they were ready to move from asking to taking. They no longer needed me to answer, because they had trained other mouths to open for them. It began with my neighbor from 2 doors down, Mrs. Albright, who had been 70 and severe. She was always neat and kind in small ways. She knocked on my door at dawn asking if I knew why the bread at her drawer had been rearranged and why the wristwatch in her nightstand ticked backward. She looked at me for a long time, and then she opened her drawer and pulled out a small picture of a man she said was her son. He had been missing for years, and she had kept his photograph, as if holding the image would keep him alive. That morning the photograph had been replaced with another one, a picture of a train station that no one could identify. Mrs. Albright stared at it, then wept softly and said, "I thought I heard him last night," and she used my name. I did not remember knowing her son, and even now I cannot recall what I told her to comfort her after Mrs. Albright. There were more little thefts, little rearrangements, and each time a drawer opened for someone else, as if the network had learned from me how to pry and how to make one person open another. The entity used the human need for closure to bind more people into the ledger. The calls spread through paper and small objects, and before I knew it, the entire stairwell of my building was altered. Each apartment bearing new items not owned by the residents. Photos appeared in frames of people no one recognized, addresses scratched into walls in foreign hand, and the smell of varnish hung in the hallway like incense. The police came once. They were bewildered at the neat stacks of photographs left on doormats, and at the reports of neighbors finding items rearranged. The cameras in the lobby showed only static during the hours when the hands were most active, but then at 3 in the morning, one of the footage frames froze on an image of my door open, and in the frame, a flash of something pale moving like a hand. The officer rubbed his eyes and said, "Perhaps vandals have been at work." There is a bureaucrat's way of softening terror into mischance, and everyone accepted it because terror is expensive to carry outside a ledger. One evening, in the fog of my sleep deprivation, I found myself compelled to go back to the elevator corridor where the heart-shaped drawer had been perched on a pedestal. I walked the city under a rain that felt like glass shards, and when I arrived, the corridor was gone, as if it had never existed. The building's elevator opened onto the same stale hall I had always walked, and the pedestal was no more, but on the sidewalk outside, someone had left a small parcel with my name in hand. I did not recognize inside was a matchbook from a bar I had never visited and a ticket stub with a date that had not yet occurred. The ticket stub prickled under my skin like a needle, and I drove to the place printed on a voucher, though I did not know why. The location was a derelict cinema that had been closed since my childhood. I parked the car, and the glove compartment rattled with a tiny ring, the absurd rotary chime my drawer had once made, and my hand shook as if the call came from within me. My ticket fit the stub exactly, and when I pressed it against the cardboard, the ink blurred and reformed into a new address, a house by the water that had never been listed on any map I had studied. Of the house by the water, it felt as if the hands had set a scene for me the way a director arranges actors and props. The front door was ajar, and inside someone had placed rows of drawers salvaged and varnished, each one labeled with names and dates. And when I stepped closer, I realized these were not random. They bore names of people who had disappeared from the city across the past decades. And in each drawer, a small phone sat, and next to each phone, a photograph of the person associated with the name. The place smelled like wood polish and old corded lines, and every phone hummed with the softest vibration, as if storing a breath. I remember sitting on the floor and feeling the floorboards like ribs under my hands. I heard the faintest rustle, as if pages were turning, and the drawers leaned slightly, as if someone inside them were shifting. Their voices rose together in a sound like wind inside a piano. They did not call my name, but they called others, and the names were streets and addresses, and as the chorus swelled, I heard one of the recorded voices call out in my own cadence a phrase I had written in a notebook weeks before, a private confession about my brother. In the moment it sounded, there was a pain in my ear, as if something had bit me from the inside. I understood then the final form of what they wanted. The entity did not seek to possess a single life. It aimed to create a registry, a supply chain of attention, where people would call out into drawers and other people would answer, and then their answers would echo into still more closed spaces until the whole city became a labyrinth of listening. My particular role had been to teach the model how to solicit and to curate the voices it would extract from human despair and curiosity. Panic unfolded like a fissure. After that, I tried to burn the ticket stubs. I tried to smash the little drawer phone. I tried to cut the cord with scissors until my hands bled, but each object I destroyed reappeared where it had been before or in some other drawer in the apartment, until destruction seemed pointless. The entity had made its system redundant. It could replicate its signs across space, just as a virus replicates patterns of code. People began to act differently around me, some with pity and some with a strange hunger, as if they had been infected by a small tooth of the entity. Their eyes slide to drawers in conversation, and their hands made small motions under tables, as if practicing how to open the wooden mouse with the right pressure. I could see the contagion like ripples on a pool, and I could do nothing but catalog the damage and watch. The last crucial act the hands asked of me was a reading. I was to go from apartment to apartment and recite names. Into each drawer, I would open the dresser and speak a name into the darkness, and the voice on the other end would answer back with a chorus. And then the drawer would close. The keepers had tried to stop me once. I told one of them that I would not comply, and he had placed his palm on my chest and said that refusing was deadly in its own way, because refusal would make the network more hungry. It would seek other mouths in. Panic and the cost would be multiplied. So I began to walk at night with a little black phone in my pocket and a list of names on paper and a tremor in my knees. I moved down the block and into stairwells where the air tasted like paper and salt. I opened drawers in borrowed apartments, rooms that were not mine, and spoke names into the wood as if naming items in an inventory. Each time it felt like offering a piece of myself, a fragment of identity, and each time the response was a tightening in my limbs as if I had given something away that could not be taken back. Neighbors thought I was on drugs. When they saw me, they laughed at my manner for a while. Then they began to avoid me. After the photographs started appearing in their mailboxes and the drawers in their homes began to vibrate at night, I would hear a chain of calls from one building to the next, a cascade of drawers answering each other. And when I recorded those nights later, the tapes contained not human speech, but the sound of many mouths chewing. Would the final morning arrived like any other, but I knew it was not. For days the voices had been softer, as if conserving strength, and the city itself seemed to hold its breath. There was no wind outside the windows, and the light was a colorless white. I had been sent by the voice to the top floor of a building with an address written on a ticket that had not yet occurred. I climbed the stairs barefoot, my feet sticky with varnish that seemed to appear from nowhere, and I reached a room where a single drawer sat on a low table. On the table beside it, there was a photograph of my brother, smiling in a way I had never seen before. He was young and unscarred, and the picture burned into my chest with heat. My hands moved of their own accord. I pulled the drawer open, and the racket of ringing flooded out, so loud I covered my ears, and yet the sound entered my head directly, and I began to say the names I had practiced into the open mouth of the wood. My voice sounded like someone else's reciting from a list I did not know by heart, and as each name left my lips, the drawer seemed to drink it, and a small figure coalesced inside like steam forming in a shape. When I reached the final name, the room shifted, and the hand pushed through from the inside, this time whole, and not a finger, but an arm, pale and thin, and clothed in something that smelled like river. Silk it curled around the edge of the drawer like a vine, and then the face appeared, pushed against the wood. A face that for a terrible suspended second looked exactly like my brother, and then not like him at all. The expression was wrong, and the eyes were gray and hollow, and when it spoke, it used his voice and mine at once, and it said, "Thank you." The thing that came out of the drawer was not my brother. It was not a person I recognized. It had the geometry of human limbs with the wrong number of joints, and when it stood, it moved with a slow and precise intention that made my knees fail. It took a step toward me, and I tasted metal as if my teeth had become bells, and the room thickened like syrup. The last thing I can remember in any detail is the way the small phone in my pocket buzzed, and from it my own voice spoke back to me, answering a question I had never asked for. "Do you keep the rest?" That was the moment the network closed the ledger around me. I found myself sitting later on a bench staring at the river while the world continued on with its indifferent chores. The keepers came and tried to take me away, but their hands felt clumsy and human. The drawers inside their houses were locked and silent for a little while, and when I told them what had happened, they wrote it down the way people write down confessions, my voice on paper, small and clear. As a receipt, "I have been trying to reach you," is the phrase that now lives like a seed inside my chest. It germinates when I open a book, when I close a drawer, when I meet someone at a grocery store, and later that night, I find photographs slid under my door. The city whispers from its wooden mouths, and the people look at their furniture with a new wary tenderness, like one who realizes a thing they have loved might also be a monster. This account is both a ledger and a warning. I have written names down, and I have crossed them off. I have tried ending the phone calls by silence, by destruction, by exile, and nothing ends them, because they are not merely sounds. They are an economy of attention, and attention is currency, and we have spent ourselves into debt, the hand will continue to practice their graceful theft because there are always drawers to pry open, and there are always people who will answer because curiosity and yearning are animals, and they do not die easily. If there is one thing that the months of this ordeal have taught me, it is that enclosed spaces hold more than the objects we put inside them. They can harbor patience and memory. They can become instruments for a will that is patient enough to wait for someone, who will listen for someone to read their list. The phone that rings from your bedroom drawer is only a beginning, because once you answer, you become a node, and you will find yourself making the rounds, delivering names into other mouths, and you will not recognize yourself when you return. I do not know how to end this. I do not know whether by writing these pages I give the hands more material, or perhaps some small protection lies in the recording of events. I offer this as both confession and map. Take caution with closed spaces. Do not leave drawers unattended. And if you hear a ring coming from what, do not answer, because their method is gentle and their patience is infinite. And once they teach you how to listen, you may never again be able to decide what is your voice and what is theirs. I've been trying to reach you, and now I have found you, and the ledger grows with every name I have spoken and every drawer I have opened, and the city hums with a silent line that runs like a vein under our floors. If you read this and the sound begins beneath your fingertips, understand that the urge to respond is not only human, but engineered to be irresistible, and that the best defense, if any exists, is to refuse to become the phone too. Refuse to be the tongue through which the hands can spread their inventory of absence. I write this with my hands steady and my eyes tired, because to not write feels like helping them file another entry. I imagine the wood teeth closing on me slowly, and somewhere in a drawer a tiny rotary phone rings, and the voice on the other end says your name and waits until someone finally answers.